Thank you for joining us again here. I'm your host Albert Grzyzbowski at the Business Owners Show, and quite a few people saw our first interview, and they said we'd sure like to hear a little bit more. So we've taken the time and come out to the office, and we're going to do another follow up on the first interview. And I guess the big question that I have is you've had a very successful career. Uh, it's not a financial, it's not financially pressing like in many people's lives today to do this type of work. What is the reason? What is the goal? What is the driving force for doing and sharing all this information with people about CEO effectiveness?
Mhm. I think it started really when I worked for a large institution, and I saw how where the real energy was wasted in the institution. You had many bright people, you had meaningful tasks, you actually had a very elaborate and a good organization, but within each person there seemed to be some energy that was lost. And a lot of really what was interpreted as commitment was actually a kind of a compliance.
Do you, and you feel that the information that you've put together over your lifetimes of work, excuse me, and the books that you've read, you think that can help
I
these people
do,
achieve?
yeah, I think that it was really difficult to arrive at the combination of approaches. But when I was at the large institution, I read hundreds of books, and I became fairly skilled at knowing what was out there about organizations. And then in my professional background, I read a lot in the area of neuroscience, neurobiology. Of course, I'm a psychologist, so I had fairly extensive knowledge in human behavior. And when I added all of that to my understanding for business and my desire to recapture some of the lost energy, I sort of came up with a system of putting all of that together to achieve something real and that addresses what I think is the single greatest loss of energy and productivity in organizations around the world.
And that is,
That is the disparity between each individual's functioning level and their capacity, starting with the CEO of the organization.
so it's unrealized potential.
It's unrealized potential in every individual that of necessity is a consequence of the fact that none of us had perfect development, none of us had perfect environments, perfect parents, or perfect experiences. And as a result of that, we took this large circle of capacity and constructed within it a smaller circle. And the smaller circle became our identity. And the disparity between the larger circle and the smaller circle, starting with the top of the organization and going through the entire organization, is where I focus my energy because that's where the optimal leverage and the optimal resources that are untapped lie.
But we talked about this, I think, before. Isn't that smaller circle a part of survival? Isn't that the way people shield themselves?
It is. The smaller circle is well adapted for survival in the original learning context. The problem is that those early compromises that we make in order to survive, in order to get approval, love, and attention, solidify into mental models. And those mental models are carried with us throughout life. The difficulty is that the larger world does not mirror the smaller world. And so our mental models are not only constructed too soon, sometimes decades before our prefrontal area of our brain fully develops, but they are carried throughout life and applied to many situations that cause us to lose a lot of energy, creativity, and innovation because it doesn't quite fit into the world we're facing at the time. It's a little bit like trying to put a square peg in a round hole.
Now you've helped many Fortune 500 CEOs, and you've done this for many years. Do you find that the successful CEOs, their inner circle and their wider circle, seem to be more consistent with reality?
Yeah, I think that really the people walk around with a smaller circle and they're more likely to define their smaller circle as reality, even though it departs from reality to a much greater extent than the larger circle. And so the person that has optimal access to their potential, which is usually achieved and earned, it isn't something that just happens with the passage of time. You can remain a small circle throughout your entire life, and you can even experience material success. But the consequences of remaining the smaller circle is that there is a deviation between reality and the world at which that you experience or the world you see. And that deviation causes you to be less than optimal as a leader in energizing your direct reports and the organization in the interest of the larger purpose that your organization exists for.
So if and staying with the circle analogy, if we can, so the CEO with the small circle finds it very difficult to lead a group of people because those people want to be in a larger circle too in order to perform.
I think that's true. I think, including the CEO, all of us have a longing for self-realization. And all of us have a sense that we have more capability than we can access. And that sense is correct. And the problem is that society offers a lot of a lot of options and a lot of alternatives that allow us to evade that realization. And I can give you an extreme example would be, let's say, the military in a country with a powerful dictatorship, like let's say North Korea. Those individuals are conforming expertly to their expectations from the outside, but one would certainly be aware that they're giving up a lot of their individuality and a lot of their individual talents in order to conform to some larger ideology or some larger demand. Now, often that demand that's imposed from the outside doesn't offer the individual options to develop themselves. So if you think of a corporation where the person at the top is a tyrant, that corporation can accomplish a lot, particularly in the industrial age. But as gradually as society evolves and we realize that knowledge is the product of almost any organization, then it becomes extremely important to have the benefit of everyone's creativity, everyone's excitement, everyone's commitment. And you don't get that by imposing restrictions or very strong limiting kinds of rules and regulations on a workforce from above.
Now, Henry Ford said, "All I need is a pair of hands." Are you saying that's not going to work today?
I think that did work in the industrial age. A person with maybe greater wisdom, or certainly in terms of the knowledge-based society of the future, where knowledge creation is really where competition and innovation really offer a competitive advantage for countries and for organizations. Anyway, a person that I like to contrast with Henry Ford is Milton Hershey. And when Milton Hershey was building the plant at Hershey, Pennsylvania, the new chocolate factory, he had 30 or 40 men digging a foundation for the new facility. And one day, an excited financial person in his organization drove up and said, "Mr. Hershey, I have great news." And he said, "What is it?" And he said, "Well, Caterpillar has really developed a piece of equipment that can do the work of these 30 men in less time, much less expensively, and it would be a tremendous benefit for the organization." So Mr. Hershey said, "Well, let me think about this for a moment." And he reflected just briefly, and he turned to his financial person and said, "I'll take the 30 men." Well, what is the consequence of that philosophy, that way of viewing human beings? Is I remember once watching a biography of Milton Hershey's life, and one of his former CEOs was being interviewed. This person was near 90 years of age, and he was asked about Milton Hershey, and his eyes filled with tears, and he said, "I would do anything in the world for that man." And that level of commitment stimulates all kinds of things for an organization. You know, you need only think of a time when you were depressed or when you had a lot of stress in your life, and you tend to think less creatively. you tend to do what's required, but not much more. In fact, you can't even envision doing much more. But if you are empowered, if you feel seen, if someone really believes in your highest potential, then you're apt to expand and to stretch yourself and to move the smaller circle closer to the bigger circle. If everyone in an organization does that, starting with the CEO, you can imagine that organization is pursuing excellence, not only for the person at the top, not only for the company, but for all constituencies, management, employees, and customers. And when you do that in the way in which all the oars are rowing in the same direction, then you have a company that will enjoy a kind of a competitive advantage that is very difficult to overtake.
I was looking at your new web page, which is just coming out, and at the top you have self-knowledge is the ultimate power, and then you divided that into three further sections, which is resistance, understanding, and of course self-knowledge again. Could you share with us what you mean by resistance?
Well, resistance is actually on the new web homepage is going to be in the center of those three. And I guess I started with understanding because understanding really has to do with the external world. It's understanding how people function, how organizations function, how our brains function. And so understanding is kind of what I guess I would label it intellectual understanding. But then the person, we have to go within the person, like what is actually occurring inside of the person and how does that affect their productivity, their creativity, what they offer an organization. And one of the fundamental facts of life is resistance. And the words of Margaret Wheatley, who wrote a great book years ago called Leadership and the New Science, nothing living will obey. Even bacteria become penicillin resistant. And so there's a part of us, resistance, I would say, is the outer edge of the smaller circle within the larger circle. And the more resistive we are to our own personal growth and accessing our own capability, the less we have to offer anyone. Our organization, ideas that might be creative, that are put forth by others, we're less likely to react to them in creative and innovative ways. If we're in an organization that recapitulates a kind of abuse of power or sort of a dictatorial kind of organization, resistance is going to be heightened, so that you're going to get people to do what you want them to do, but not much more. And that's tremendously expensive. I remember once watching a teleconference, a satellite teleconference, in which they had a number of Fortune 500 CEOs lamenting the fact that people only offer 10 to 30% of what they could really give an organization to that organization. And that's mostly the case because they don't want to offer more. They're not motivated. They don't see an alliance between their personal development and the success of the company. And so each time a new CEO comes in, what they actually do is they squeeze more out of that 10 to 30%, and they leave untapped the 90 to 70% that every individual in an organization, whether it be in the workforce of the organization, at the top of the organization, and I would even go as far as to say the customer base, because there's a principle in psychology that commitment to a relationship or an organization is a function of the possibility of growth. And if you're an organization that helps your employees to grow and helps your customers to grow, then the kind of enduring commitment that you're going to enjoy is going to exceed your wildest expectations.
It seems that resistance is a big fear-based
Well, sometimes
human emotion.
Sometimes it's experienced as fear, but sometimes it's experienced as lack of motivation, tiredness throughout the day, lack of involvement, eye rolling behind the boss's back. There are all kinds of manifestations of resistance, and a lot of it is outside of consciousness. It's not just that someone is angry with their boss. It's they don't even know that they're resisting. They really think that they're functioning at their capacity within that context, and they're nowhere close.
And then, of course, if the CEO is afraid of change and living in a world of resistance, then how can the rest of the people function?
Well, that's a great point, because that takes us sort of to the third box on the new web page, which is self-knowledge. And I can tell you as a principal, your relationship with yourself, and I would say that means your awareness of how your mind works, your awareness that you're functioning within that small circle, your awareness that your potential exceeds your wildest expectations. As you begin to truly believe that, you begin to loosen the boundary on that smaller circle, and you begin to experience yourself in a different way. When you do that, then a whole world opens up to you that didn't exist previously. Like, if you want to see like a mini version of this, you can try walking across a campus or an organization and smiling at everyone you see, and what you'll get is a lot of return smiles. And if you walk out of your office and walk through the hall and sort of ignore or frown at everyone you see, you're going to get a like response. So the principle is that one's relationship with oneself, one's level of self-awareness, is the upper limit on the relationship they can enjoy with anyone else. And the less, the poorer your relationship with yourself is, the more you're going to evoke symptoms in other people, whether it be a spouse, friendships, colleagues in an organization's, direct reports, whoever. You're going to get evidence from the external world that there's some part of you that is denying reality and that is blind to the development of your own capabilities.
Dr. Anton, how do you cultivate individuals? As a past CEO, how do I cultivate other people?
Well, I love it's a book that really was printed several years ago, and it's been revised. It's called The Fifth Discipline, and of all the organizational books I've read, I think that's the best, and that's the one that really aligns most closely with how I have learned that human beings function. And it's a beautiful concept. A learning organization is an organization that continually evolves its capacity to create its own future. And in order to do that, Sanjay talks about the mastery of 5 disciplines. There's actually 4, because the 5th one is systems thinking, which is sort of the context in which the disciplines exist and interact. But the first discipline is called shared vision. And so right at the onset of putting an organization together, there are a couple of things that you have to have. You have to have a purpose worthy of investing in. That is, your vision has to be something that everyone in the organization can believe in and identify with. It's not just the CEO's vision of the organization. It's not something as mundane as increasing market share. It has to be something worthy of believing in, something that's transformational, something that contributes to the development of every individual within the organization, of customers of the organization, and of the leadership in the organization. When that condition exists, then you can have a conversation with your organization where you can induce the common denominators that represent what every individual sees as the progression and the goal for their own personal growth. And as you begin to generalize upon that, you develop a vision in the organization where every member of the organization and even the customers of the organization own a piece of that vision. When that occurs, the organization becomes alive, and then you can focus on the development of the 3 other disciplines, which are personal mastery, mental models, and team learning.
What I find interesting about what you're doing is that you're saying, as a CEO or a business owner, what you're saying is realize your potential, realize your limitations, understand where you are juxtaposition to the world. But you're also saying that the company, the corporation, is the same thing. So in other words, as the leader becomes realized and understands what's happening, both internally and externally,
Right.
so does the organization.
Right. I would say that the organization,
They're almost the same thing.
right, the organization is an image of the inner workings of the leadership of the organization.
So if you walk into a company and the receptionist says, what do you want? You
You
pretty
know,
well know.
right? Just as if you see a parent, that is demeaning a child, is sort of holding the child responsible for their quote bad behavior, when in fact that the context in which the child was raised led to that bad behavior. In fact, if the evolution of child therapy has gone from working with the child to working with the family, because it became clear that even if a child was able to make significant therapeutic gains and you return them back into the original learning context, that the gravity of that situation would exert an influence and the child would regress back to the old behaviors. But if you can change the parents, then you have the point of optimal leverage in changing and improving the behavior of the child. So analogously, the same is true of an organization. As the CEO begins to understand how their mind works, then the whole organization can change. I've worked with CEOs of publicly listed companies whose entire executive board was a reflection of their family, and that many of the difficulties and problems that they had among the leadership really got resolved once the CEO began to see how he or she was tacitly recreating the original learning context and validating their mental models, which were far too limiting. These are very capable, smart people, but they're only operating on many fewer cylinders than they have available.
Now, when I was younger, psychology was probably as much art as science. How has this world of psychology been validated by, let's say, empirical data and the scientific method?
Well, psychology has always really been a science. I think the idea that it's an art has to do more with the application of the science.
Or the interpretation.
Like for example, cockpits in airplanes are defined by psychologists who are experts in human factors, who understand where the instruments need to be located for optimal safety, et cetera, et cetera. Many of the learning paradigms about how people learn, a lot of the rehabilitative paradigms are all motivation, emotion, how people interact, what areas of their brains are involved in solving tasks. These are all parts of the science of psychology.
So these methods that we talk about, these are reproducible methods. They've been tested. I mean, these ideas that were...
Yeah, what I'm talking about is cutting edge.
You just didn't come up with this.
No.
These are a body of work.
Yeah, these are individuals that have spent their life. For example, Peter Senge is a professor at Sloan Business School at MIT. The Fifth Discipline is a book on organizations that really is sensitive to how people function and really provides an architecture for what to do in an organization outside of a psychological perspective. A book by Robert Cooper, The Other 90%, and many of his other books, is an excellent depiction of the neuroscience of leadership, so that we now understand, for example, how the brain functions. We understand from Cooper's books, for example, that all of us have two hardwired brain tendencies. One is to interpret ambiguity as danger, and the other is, in the face of stress, to increase the intensity, frequency, and duration of habitual responses. So why would the brain interpret ambiguity as danger? Well, probably the reason we're alive today is because our ancestors interpreted ambiguity as danger, that when they heard some leaves rustling in the forest, those that took the quick evasive action were the ones that survived. So we're really pre-programmed to interpret ambiguity as danger. Now, we no longer live in that kind of environment, yet our corporations, our boardrooms are constantly worried about competition, about the competition.
Rustling.
Right, leaves rustling, the competition overtaking us. The wise executive understands that competition and excellence are actually incompatible. Competition is a contest between two small circles in separate organizations or in separate representing separate individuals' mental models. Excellence is the reduction of the volume between the larger circle and the smaller circle within each individual. So the person that achieves excellence, that where their smaller circle grows to equal their bigger circle, which is theoretically possible, though I don't think any of us ever achieve it 100%, is at a tremendous competitive advantage relative to the person that's still operating out of the smaller circle, but their goal was not competition. Remember, they had a higher purpose. Their higher purpose was to recapture the lost parts of themselves and to become closer to all that they could be, and to also allow that same privilege for all who work with them and for them.
So those successful CEOs, they hear the leaves rustling and they're not necessarily getting ready to fight or flight. They're going, maybe there's an opportunity.
That's exactly right. And you know, it's interesting because there's some research in neuroscience that has demonstrated that one humiliation can permanently alter the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, kind of in the center of the brain. Now, we know, for example, that what most distinguishes human beings from primates is the cerebral cortex, in particular the frontal cortex, and even more particular, the prefrontal cortex. That's the most recently evolved and the most highly integrative area of the brain. So that area doesn't fully develop till after age 26. Yet our mental models of the world that we talked about earlier develop in childhood, and they become relatively solidified, and we create our world. We contribute to what we see, but the metaphorical lenses that we look through are not reality, but are the mental models that we develop to survive in that early period of our life. Now, it's too bad because when our frontal lobes our prefrontal area of our frontal lobes to fully develop at age 26, we have an opportunity that's unparalleled. It's like a rocket that takes off the ground very slowly on one type of fuel and then discards those fuel tanks and then is propelled into the future on another. Many human beings keep those original fuel tanks and in a very cumbersome fashion negotiate the world, whether it be in organizations, relationships, or whatever.
How important is the concept of empathy versus, let's say, sympathy?
I think empathy, that a person grows in empathy, they're able to put themselves in another's shoes if they're able to know themselves better. That again, your own level of self-knowledge is the upper limit on your capacity for empathy.
So if you don't know yourself, it's impossible to be empathetic to others' positions.
Right. If you don't know yourself,
therefore you can't be a leader.
Right. The way that a child knows themselves is narcissistic. And if you know yourself only in a childlike prefrontal development mental model kind of way, then every relationship is interpreted in terms of what it can do for you, but not what it can really do for you, not in a healthy way, not what it can do for you in terms of reducing the disparity between the larger and the smaller circle, but what it can do for you as defined by the smaller circle that has rigid boundaries around it.
You really have to know yourself to be empathetic.
Absolutely. Otherwise, every relationship becomes a narcissistic extension of yourself. And every person is seen in terms of what they can do for you in terms of your short-term small circle needs.
But then if you go too far with it, you become sympathetic, and then it's impossible to handle either.
Well, I think sympathy within ego boundaries is a very good trait to have, because empathy allows you to see the other as separate from yourself. In fact, there's a definition of love, that love is the belief in the existence of the other per se, which means the belief in the other not as a narcissistic extension of yourself, but the belief in the other as a separate entity equivalent to you, with their own history, their own limitations, their own mental models, their own circles, and their own struggles. And that suffering with and that understanding that the bell tolls for both of you, not just for you, is a kind of a sympathy. It's a sort of a way of being simpatico with another human being, and it's detected by other human beings, and that's what forms relationships, and that's what forms motivated and energized workforces.
Are people fragile, or are they strong and they can deal with things? Change.
I think both. I think there are some human beings that have had very harsh experiences developmentally that have caused them to have a kind of an accommodation which is brittle and fragile and that makes their life fairly difficult. At the same time, I believe in human resiliency. The brain is enormously plastic. The human brain is capable of more interconnections than there are particles in the universe. I would never underestimate the capacity for growth of any individual, nor the striving for growth. The only way that we become unaware of our striving and become satisfied with the status quo is if we believe our own propaganda that we are all that we think we are and there is no more. And if you're thinking that way, you can count on it, you're wrong.
So if there's a CEO out there or a company owner and they really have to get their act together to be competitive to even survive, and I've met a number of companies like that. They really have to change in order to survive, and they really have to tap into this. You have to start with allowing. You have to change the CEO, but at the same time, you have to create some kind of a safe area for the employees to flourish. How would that work? If let's say the entire company's strung out, they're stressed out, the people are sitting there going from day to day, they don't know if they're going to be there, and I see this on a fairly regular basis. Can you change, and without making promises or anything, but how hard is it to change that culture?
Well, I think the point of optimal leverage is the CEO themselves. For example, I'm not real interested in working with an organization where the CEO isn't involved or where the CEO isn't willing to be part of the change themselves, because that sort of tells you all that you need to know. Oftentimes consultants will go into an organization and do the CEO's bidding, even though they know at some level that the CEO is coming out of the smaller circle. And I think that
kind of like a consultant-run company.
Yeah, that really only results in a progression towards the organization's eventual demise. At the same time, when you go into an organization, you have to take the organization and the CEO where they are. And once they detect that you understand that they're talented, very capable people, and you understand the vicissitudes of being a CEO, that there's really no one in the organization that you can rely on because you're expected to be a calming influence on the entire organization. So it's a very lonely position. And often that's what keeps people fixed, is that they either don't have access to the kind of sophisticated coaching that can help transform them and their organization, or they don't even believe or know where to look for it or that it's possible. I've worked with a lot of CEOs individually and organizations, and frankly, it was a desire to reach out beyond what I could do on an individual basis that prompted me to develop this website, because I think there's a lot of people out there that are sub-threshold. They don't have the level of awareness that they're ready to look at themselves, or where they actually see themselves as the greatest limitation on their company, but they have an inkling that they are part of what is holding their organization back. And my hope is that by providing knowledge, some experiences, and some exposure to these ideas, that inkling can be cultivated and can actually burst into kind of a curiosity about self. And when that gets developed, then the organization can become more dynamic and can really begin to grow.
You said that folks only invest in what they create.
Yep. People only
Is that
invest
really
in
that deep? I mean, was the paycheck not enough?
Well, the paycheck is enough for compliance. and showing up to work. But again, remember that organizations and companies today are competing on the basis of knowledge. They're not competing on the basis of products. I mean, you just have to look at a company like Apple, where innovation, is occurring, on a monthly basis, and there's a constant cycle of new product development. Those products don't get developed except in an atmosphere where everybody is motivated, is willing to offer something. Now, sometimes, I have to admit, you get a lot of very intelligent people graduated from MIT, and they operate within that very little circle, kind of like Beethoven. They produce very high levels of achievement out of that small circle, but the larger organization has to find a way to broaden every individual in the organization if they really want to survive and thrive in the knowledge-based society of the future. And that's what the 21st century and the global economy is all about. One of the reasons that I recently gave a talk to a national organization that consults around the country, and it was kind of a talk that I would identify as train the trainer. And I started with an integration of some great ideas in history, the history of leadership, the qualities of great leaders, and I integrated that with the neuroscience of leadership and Peter Senjay's book on the fifth discipline, which was my favorite book about organizations, and coupled that with my knowledge as a psychologist, a former leader in a large organization, and a psychoanalyst, and provided a series of examples which illustrated for this organization how they can begin to redefine their sense of purpose and how they can begin to develop every member of the organization so that each time one of the coaches or consultants that are part of that organization goes into a company or a large firm, they're going in as the leader until they can develop the leader's capacity to know themselves and know how their own mind works. And so it's kind of training the trainer to see themselves as the instrument. The more the trainer knows themselves, the more they can relate to the CEO in a way where the CEO detects that they have the capacity to help them transform themselves, and they can experience a kind of a respect that comes from the humility of knowing yourself. My favorite definition, by the way, of humility is from an old medieval monk, and humility is defined as knowing yourself as you truly are.
What I like about your program, among many things that I like, but the thought that comes to mind is like a crewing boat, where you have the CEO at the back and the coxswain. He can steer all he wants, but without everybody
rowing
paddling
in the same direction.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like your program is, for the first time that I've heard, is saying, hey, all hands have to be on deck in order to be competitive in today's competitive world.
Yeah, and I would add one more thing to it, that the only way all hands can be on deck in a meaningful way is voluntary.
And whipping them is not going to help.
Whipping them is going to create emotionality. There's some interesting research. You asked me earlier if psychology was a science or an art. There's some interesting research in the animal laboratory in psychology on punishment. And, one of the interesting things about, if you want to eliminate a behavior, people frequently resort to punishment, and organizations, have adopted this from the lab. And the thing about punishment that's so interesting is that it's very gratifying to the punisher, that if you can hurt someone bad enough, quickly enough, you can suppress their behavior. But there's also a principle in the lab that says punishment suppresses behavior, but it doesn't eliminate it. So that there's always going to be part of that organism that's going to experience punishment in a negative way and react emotionally. And then you're going to be complicating the exercise of your leadership, because now you're intertwining emotionality with creating knowledge. And it's a very bad combination. If you've ever tried to think clearly or be innovative when you're depressed or anxious, it doesn't work. the way to eliminate behavior is extinction. And so many people resort to punishment in various ways that actually backfire in terms of the productivity and investment and commitment going forward.
When all of your concepts come together, you've seen this happen on a board level, on a let's say an officer level of corporations. You've seen all this come together for CEOs. I bet there's some sense of happiness. There's some sense of satisfaction when you see that working.
Yeah, I am satisfied because this is something that really has been put together over the last 20 years of my career, where I had the privilege of operating at a very high level in a large organization. And I was around people who were avid readers and thinkers. They were all in leadership positions, but they were always, reading the latest articles in the Harvard Business Review, the latest business books. And that's how by reading through and plowing through all of this literature and having conversations with my colleagues, I eventually came upon what I thought was really the most important ingredients for an organization, and they involved those components that are on my website.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing your time with us again. This is our second interview, and
Well, thank you.
And I enjoyed it.
Well, I appreciate you being interested enough to do this again.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.